Hey there, Eager to Pleasers. Welcome back to the Eager to Please podcast. I'm so glad you're listening today because joining us is Megan Flores, a licensed professional counselor here in the Nashville area who specializes in helping both men and women who want more for themselves and their lives, but just don't know where to start. What I love most about Megan is her non-traditional approach to therapy. And I'm so grateful she's here today to help us dive further into these topics. Where does people pleasing come from? Does your family or the way you were raised play a role in shaping that characteristic in you? And how does one heal from chronic people pleasing? Megan, I know that you have an extremely full plate these days, so thank you so much for making the time to be here.
I'm truly so grateful to be here.
I realize the older I get, the more I believe how small this world really is. And I wanted to share with our listeners that I feel like our paths were meant to connect because we have such similar stories. What's ironic is that you and I met in a roundabout way, indirectly through music, actually. And a few years ago, I was working as one of your husband's interns, learning about artist management. And I don't know how it came up, but he mentioned that you had your own therapy practice, and I was instantly intrigued. So naturally, what I did...
Which is always a risky thing for him to mention. Sometimes I'm like, don't tell people that.
Exactly, because you never know.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly. You just never know where that's going to go. But curious minds did want to know, and I went and looked you up. Funny enough, I learned that you and I actually have a lot in common. After reading your posts about your own struggles and triumphs, I became a huge fan. You have a natural ability to convey feelings in a way that's relatable, not just clinical textbook regurgitation. And when I had the idea of starting this podcast, you were honestly the very first person that I thought of to be a guest on the show because I knew you would be able to share real experiences and provide guidance for those of us who struggle with being people pleasers.
I'm honored.
So I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit more about your journey and how you decided to go from accounting to therapy.
Sure. Which is just funny. I am thinking, even now we're sitting in a real studio, whereas when I met you, you and Eric were working upstairs in our house that's now a child's bedroom. So yeah, we've just come
so much has changed.
A long way. Yeah,
Yes.
You had 3 girls at the time, and I had no girls, and now here I am with 3 myself.
That's right.
Let's see. I studied accounting in school because I thought this is such a safe job. You can come out of school and there's a clear path. You can make a lot of money, and it just felt. I also liked numbers. I liked what I was doing, but I did it mostly because it sounded like a good path, something I should do. And fortunately, I got an internship right out of school that was at Nike out in Oregon. And when I went out there, I was working actually in marketing, but I kind of had this moment where I was like, man, I don't think it gets better than this. Like, this is like the job everybody would want or the job I'm supposed to want. And at the end of the day, it's like just another job. I didn't feel any more content or satisfied. And something in me was like, there has to be more than this, which is kind of like, just, if you know me, it's like a great thing about me and a terrible thing is like this quest for like something more. And so I really was like, well, if it doesn't seem like being rich is going to make me very happy. So I thought like, man, maybe being like giving all this up would make me happy. And so I went and like to Africa to do mission work. Yeah, I don't know if you know that part.
I did not know that part.
Wow. It feels like lifetimes ago. But I moved to Africa and I was like, maybe I'll be a missionary the rest of my life. And I very quickly got there and was like, okay, this is not for me either.
Totally different.
Put in my 6 months. And then came back home and was like, gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do now. And I had a friend living in Nashville she was coaching the soccer team at a university here and going to school and getting her therapy degree. And she was like, they need a golf coach. Why don't you come down here and just coach golf and figure it out? And so then when I got down here, she was like, why don't you take this like seminar with me? And the university is kind of like, you can do it for free, you're coaching our team. So I took this seminar, and I don't even know what the seminar was, but the therapist that was teaching the class said, oh, this is dangerous, but said the parent you think harmed you the most is not the one that harmed you the most. It's the other one. And I thought, that can't be true. That's definitely not true. But something about that then sent me down this like rabbit hole, not necessarily of like my parents, but just of relearning my own story. And I asked that therapist at the time, like, hey, you know, I think you could help me. I've always had all sorts of things going on. And so I'd done therapy before, but nothing was very effective. I think and it's hard to do therapy with young people because
you think you know it all, or
and like you have such a limited scope, and typically, like at least in the world I come from, there's still some parental like financial support. And I'm always telling clients, I don't normally work with people under the age of like 25, but until you're financially free from your family and like totally on your own, you're not free,
right?
Or you're not free to make your own decisions, because it's like if I'm working with somebody and they're saying like, I don't think it's helpful for me to be with my family for Thanksgiving, but that parent owns that car that they're driving or helps pay rent. Chances are, if you're in my office talking about this, the moment that person says to their parents like, oh, I'm not going to make it home for Thanksgiving this year, there's going to be something that they might lose that car. They might lose that financial support, you know. Or even if you don't lose it, there's still like, your parents still could take it.
Right.
So anyhow, it's not necessarily that doesn't one-to-one with my story, but it's hard to work with young people for that reason. And so all that to say, I took this class, I got into my own therapy that was actually effective at this point. Really, the therapist at the time actually said like, you know, I don't have anybody I could refer you to, and you probably can't afford my fee, but you could join one of my groups. And a lot of people are not familiar with group therapy, but I'm like an avid fan and run groups myself. But this therapist let me join this group for $10 a session.
Oh, nice. Wow.
Which is totally crazy. Now looking back, I understand why, because it's so hard to get people to join a group. But I didn't have like much money at the time, or not much access. And so it was a gift. But that sent me down this huge therapeutic journey where really, I mean, it's still, I don't want to be like, oh, I crossed the finish line, because I'm still discovering and working on things myself every single day. But that's where I really started to get some momentum in changing my life, and had a long period of time where I really was substance free, so that I could really focus on
clarity.
Clarity, being with myself. I tell people like that therapist said to me like, hey, I think you would really benefit from like a more intensive treatment. And I was like, oh, he's crazy. Like, no, I'm fine. Like, look at me, look at my resume. Like, my life is so great, even though at the time I was like miserable. And I didn't go to like an intensive treatment because my life was so spiraling out of control. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know what other people perceived, but really I walked into this hotel room one day on a golf trip, and I just like had this moment of clarity where I thought, man, if I don't really do something different, in 10 years, I'm going to be married to some guy that looks great and makes a lot of money. I'll be driving a nice car with, 2.5 kids in the back seat. And I'll probably just be drinking wine like every night to like survive my life.
Yeah.
And, we'll stay married because that's what I know, like, but we'll be in like a miserable marriage. And that's how we'll live out the days of our lives. And I just really thought, like, that's not what I want. So I went down my own therapeutic journey, and I never, like, intended on becoming a therapist. It was kind of like a backward route. But I think after stepping into, like, more and more freedom from lots of things, including what we're going to call people-pleasing, I wanted to help other people get some semblance of what I got.
Yeah, I love that. You mentioned something just now about, these, I'm going to call them in their early 20s, these young kids. I feel like I fell into that trap, and I can only say that now because hindsight's 2020.
Sure.
And now that I'm in my 40s and looking back, I feel like I was living in a fog. Like, no joke. I had no idea that I was so unhappy in whatever situation I was in. I just felt like I had to keep pushing through. And I do feel like with maturity and life experiences, you're able to kind of reflect back on that. And you're like, you know what? Life's too short to do the stuff I was doing. And how do you get from that into clarity and finding peace and happiness?
And then clarity and peace. I mean, can you get it without blowing your whole life up?
That's a good question.
I
don't know.
I don't know.
I had to blow my life up in order to find it, but yeah.
I sure see people, and I don't really have any judgment the way that people do things, but I see people that I work with try to do it like inch by inch. I see people blow the whole thing up. I see people get close, maybe relationally, to blowing the whole thing up, and I've had one successful couple kind of come back from that.
Nice. That's amazing.
I don't have all the answers, and I'm willing to explore it. I know it takes drastic measures to change things.
It does. And I feel like sometimes you try one thing and it doesn't work. And then you try another thing and it doesn't work. And sometimes you do have to make a drastic change in order to figure out, okay, I need to have a clean slate. And then we need to start from there. I came across an article from Psychology Today that was just recently published in August of 2024. And it was talking about the idea that people-pleasing is not a personality flaw, but it can be considered a coping mechanism or a response to trauma. And I did a little more digging and a little more reading, and this notion of fawning, which they labeled as, the fourth trauma response, because I think we've all heard fight, flight, or freeze. But this one called fawning was new to me. And when I was reading the description of it, I'm like, oh my gosh, again, going back to the fog that I thought I was in, I had no idea that I was even doing that until I discovered I was doing it. So can you talk a little bit about what that term fawning means?
Oh, it's new to me as well.
Oh.
I was kind of prepping for this and saw that, and I was like, what the hell is fawning? I don't know. And then I'm still not quite sure. I liked everything I read about it, and basically it's talking about I'm trying to define trauma response, but in a situation that feels unsafe, maybe, or heightened,
or neglected, being neglected or something. Mm-hmm.
The tendency, rather than to fight or freeze, is to then jump into pleasing or doing what the other person wants you to do so that you can stay safe.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm still exploring this myself. I'm like, have they rebranded codependency?
Maybe. I don't know.
I'm reading it, and the word codependency is thrown around so much, but its basic level means I need you to be okay so that I can be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so really at the heart of that, it's I'm going to try to control how you feel so that I can feel different. The only distinguisher I would make is fawning feels a little bit more like you're in a victim state.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was thinking how they just rebranded codependency, I'm like, I don't want that to sound attacking.
Yeah.
Because it does sound like a survival mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
But codependency in some ways is probably a survival mechanism as well.
Yeah.
And so I think that, for me, the more I've kind of read and thought about it, it's this response of I don't know if you've heard of, in my world, sometimes they'll say dance monkey. It's kind of oh no, I don't like the expression or whatever's going on in your face, so I'll just start to dance and to get your face to change. And so I kind of thought of it like that. I'm sure there's a lot of different ways to go about it. Another story I kind of thought, and you can tell me if you feel like this is a good picture, but my sister and I were actually at a bar and we were talking, and she was like, yeah, why is it that people always say, or just act inappropriate towards me? And I was like, I don't know. I'll have to observe you, what.
Are you giving off some vibes?
Yeah. I was like, I don't know what you're doing. Or I said, I think you're probably too inviting. Because I'm people, for me, I kind of just shut things down because I'll just sit there and stare.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, not 10 minutes later, this guy like kind of walks past us. We were standing at this table that was on the way to the bathroom. And I don't even know what he said, but it was something that made me feel weird inside. And she kind of like laughed it off. It almost like in a playful way.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went to the bathroom. And I said, like, I think that's what you're talking about. I was like, what do you feel? Like, this is what happens when you have a sister that's a therapist. I'm like, what do you feel? And she's like, I was just so scared. And I was like, okay, next time if somebody, it doesn't have to be a man or woman says something that makes you feel that kind of like fear or weird, I was like, I want you just to look at them and like turn around, because we don't know this guy.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Just like turn away and just start talking to me. Especially if it's something, it wasn't like wildly inappropriate. It was just kind of like, why are you talking to us?
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought of that as like, oh, that's kind of that fawning response. That's like, I got panicked. I like laugh when really you're the one being inappropriate.
Yes, that's super interesting. I hear exactly what you're saying, because I feel like I could picture that scenario where she was uncomfortable maybe with the comment that he was giving her or the look that he was giving her, and she just wanted to like kind of move him along. So she's like, okay, yeah, sure, thanks, whatever, and carry on.
Which we're not, it's like the way I respond is out of my own story. Like in some ways I'm like, it might be a little better if I did laugh it off. But again, not necessarily.
Yeah.
But everybody's kind of responding in a way to try to survive.
Exactly. So in that definition of fawning, I feel like as a kid, I never felt like harmed in that respect. Like I grew up in a household that, I don't know, I feel like was a little untraditional, because it didn't always feel like we had, the Leave It to Beaver, whatever you want to call it, like happy family, where it's like the picture perfect. Oh, okay, we do everything together. We go on family vacations together. For me, the fawning definition came from my dad ended up getting sick when I was in middle school. He got diagnosed with ALS. Mm-hmm. And I felt like, because he was shutting down physically, that he was dealing with probably his own stress and his own, way of dealing with that and managing what that will look like and how long do I have left to live and that kind of thing. And I felt like I didn't ever want to rock the boat or make waves and, the yes sir, yes ma'am type thing. Like, you just did what was asked. Maybe that was my coping mechanism there.
I mean, it's even raising kids now, it just gives me so much perspective of what it was maybe like as a child. Mm-hmm. I think having my own children is the only way I could really understand that. But it's, of course, it's like, I don't know that much about your parents, but if I just think of any human, that would be a lot to navigate in your own, in like my own life or my own marriage. Mm-hmm. And then for the child to kind of be observing that, it seems like a really normal response that you'd be like, okay, I don't want to make any waves. I'll just do things to make my parents happy.
Yeah.
And go about things that way to take stress off of them. But then I think it's hard, because when you are so good at things, a lot of times the natural response is kind of like, oh, we don't have to worry about Natalie. Like,
yes, right.
I don't know if parents say that anymore, but you certainly, like, when I was growing up, it's like, oh, she's just so good, so easy. We don't have to worry about her.
Exactly. And that was actually another thing when I said that we're very similar in that respect. I feel like I followed kind of the same path that you did. You did well in school and you were athletic, and everyone just came to expect that that's what you were going to uphold all the time. And if you slipped, it's like, oh, well, what happened? What's going on? You didn't get an A on this or whatever. And it's like, okay, I'm human too. Like, sure. And then you end up putting all this pressure on yourself that all these people are expecting you to get this level of whatever. And it just kind of snowballs from there.
Yeah, it's like, this is who you are. And I mean, there's subtle ways that people communicate things and that people then internalize it. Because, this would be funnier to you that Eric, but I'm like, if you could observe a conversation in our kitchen, like, it's like me putting my head in my hands, because we were talking about, I was like, oh yeah, I'm doing this episode on people pleasing, and I was kind of talking about it, and he's like, well, I mean, inherently, there's nothing wrong with people pleasing. He's like, I mean, it's like we should want to please others. And I'm like, well, yes. I'm like, why can't you just ever go along with what I'm saying? But I like that he like makes me think about things in different ways. So then I started thinking, and I'm like, well, it is kind of true. Like, I want to please you right now in this episode. Like, I want to like please Eric so that he does things that please me back. Like, there is this people, like pleasing other people inherently is not a bad thing.
Right.
I think the question is like, what does it cost you? Because then we were kind of talking about my own story, and it's like, okay, well, what happened for me is that rather than like actually learning things in school, all I did was like learn how to be very good at taking tests or how to really like figure out this material so that I could get an A in this class. But I don't remember any. Like
Exactly.
Eric,
right.
We joke, like Eric went to summer school, I guess, sometimes, and like he would get A's in math and flunk out in English, like whatever. And I am so envious of that. I'm like, gosh, like what would it have been like for me just to really focus on the things I liked,
Right.
and to allow myself to just, I mean, it's not necessarily a good thing that he was flunking these other things, because that's something in and of itself, but this freedom that like he was really just learning. And I wasn't learning. I was trying to achieve,
right,
so that I could keep getting this like positive reinforcement from people about how smart I was. Or it sounds like, you know, similar for you. And so then the cost there is like, I know for a fact, like my senior year of high school, I was like, I got to take all these AP classes so that my ranking is this, so that my grades are that, so that I'm here in my class. It's like, I didn't think like, oh, what classes would I like to take?
Yes. You know, that's so funny that you say that, because I felt like that when I was in high school too. I had a younger sister who was 14 months younger than me.
Ooh.
So we were close in age and kind of ran with the same people, and our personalities could not have been different. I mean, and again, I don't know if I was just groomed for this, or that's what people expected of me, or I don't know. And maybe we dig into that a little bit.
14 months apart. You couldn't be more different.
Oh my gosh. That's so
funny. Teach me here now.
Yeah.
But they are. The one will sit at the table and color for 2 hours. And my other child is like 2 minutes later, she's throwing the marker against the wall. You know? So, okay, go on.
Well, I was just thinking that I was so serious about school for that reason. You know, like I needed to get straight A's. I wanted to get into a good school, and, you know, didn't want to let anyone down. And my younger sister was the socialite, and I envied her for that, because I'm like, man, look at her. She's having so much more fun. She's laughing all the time. And she cared about her grades, but not really. She, you know what I mean? She didn't take it as seriously, but she still ended up getting with A's and B's. And I'm like, man, I would kill to just let myself get a B.
Sure.
Or, you know, I think there's a story that my mom makes fun of me for. I got a C on, I don't know, I forget what it was, maybe a college course or something. And I threw myself on the floor crying and having a tantrum like a toddler, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I got a C. And my mom's like, good for you. You know, pat yourself on the back.
The only C I've ever gotten in my life. I can still tell you the classes.
That's funny.
Computer science.
Oh,
like accounting.
That's terrible.
But yeah, there's this envy of like, what's it like to just be able to be,
yes,
or to have a different set of perspective. Like my parents were telling me a story the other day I had never heard, but it was about one of my other sisters and getting these test results back. And my mom said like, oh, how do you feel about your test results? And my sister said, it says I'm average.
You're average. Oh gosh.
And my mom was like, okay, does that work for you? And she's like, yeah, that's great. I'm average. And I'm like, yeah, I would have been like distraught.
Exactly.
Over my averageness. But yeah, I think that's where like I work with a lot of high achievers, and part of that is athletes, and you know, there's all this stuff out there for mindfulness, and they're often coming to me like, oh, how can I perform better? Don't you have any skills or whatever, all this stuff. And we do a lot of different things, but the reality is that like most of the people that I end up working with, when we get to the root of it, it's this huge like shame core, which is basically like, if I'm not performing well, then I'm less of a human, or I'm not worth anything. And so I'm like, sure, it's hard to like hit a golf ball or swing a baseball bat, when like you're out there trying to earn your worth.
Right.
I mean that, and I'm kind of like, I don't have any like simple tricks for that. That's kind of deep therapeutic work that's far beyond.
Yes.
No wonder the mindfulness only works so much. It's a combination of things all the time. But
so from a therapy perspective, I guess, where does this people-pleasing trait come from? Is it innately born in you? Is it something that you learn as you're growing up? I mean, I personally think it does come from how you're raised and what you see in your family or how your family treats you. But I'm curious from like a therapeutic perspective.
I think it's the golden question.
Okay.
I mean, I guess people have been debating this forever and ever, and we can talk about it even. It's like nature versus nurture. I don't know exactly. Like, even if you ask me, like, how much is nature? How much is nurture? I don't even know that I can place like a number on it. I think that I know that there has to be things in your personality subset that are like predisposing you to be a certain way, right? But then, hell yeah, I mean, nurture is so much, and that can mean, I think a lot of people are afraid of therapy because it tends to have some sort of air of like crucifying your parents.
Right.
And then, we're both parents. And so, sure, some of it is things your parents intentionally did, but some of it is things your parents unintentionally did. Or like, again, even observing in my own, I can observe this in my family of origin, like the one I came from, and I can observe this with my children. Like, each child I have is being raised by a different set of parents. Like birth order matters, the number of kids in your family matters, your parents' emotional capacity matters, like your parents' health matters, your financial state matters. I have a lot of people that will kind of laugh. I think it's a common thing. I saw it in somebody's comedy skit too, where like, if you're the firstborn child, just how different that might be than the lastborn.
Yeah.
Even like from a financial state, you'll hear a lot like, oh, my parents gave me like $20 and then my sister just had the credit card like running around, whatever. But so I think there's a lot of different factors, but you mentioned the article that you read, and I would say there's different ways of relating as a parent. Ideally, the energy when you're a child, so we're talking 18 and under, like a legal under the age of 18, the energy should be coming from your parent toward you. So that should look like parent is nurturing you, educating you, helping you understand yourself, like helping you navigate the world. Unfortunately, a lot of us, the energy is actually going from the child to the parent, which is like, hey, how do I make sure mom is okay? How do I make sure dad is okay? How do I, whether it's in your case, like make their lives easier? How do I make them happy? How do I, because in any family, like I tell people this, it's like, if the option is to blame yourself or your parents, you're going to blame yourself. And that's actually a very useful thing, because if you're 10 years old and you're like, man, my mom sucks. Like, what are you going to do? I mean, that's pretty desperate.
Is that when the rebellion comes out?
I don't know, but I think that's when, like, then you say, like, I don't know that it's conscious or this clear, but like, oh, it must be something wrong with me. If I just do better in school, then mom will be happy. If I just, help out more around the house, mom will be happy, or like whatever that looks like. But then that's what I mean when the energy starts to go toward the parent, rather than introspectively or like kind of being with yourself. Because when I think about people pleasing, I think about it's two things. I think it's a lot of things, but I think about the betrayal of self. You kind of learn how to leave yourself in like the other room and kind of like soldier on. And then I think the work as an adult really has to do with feelings avoidance. Because when you're pleasing or you're performing, you're trying to change the feeling state in another person so that you can change the feeling state in yourself. And so when I think about like, what does recovery from people pleasing look like? It's like, you have to start with like, what do you feel, so that kind of like what you're trying to do with other people's feelings to change your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you just took the question right out of my mouth. I was going to ask you, it's not always evident that you're a people pleaser when you're in the moment. I think sometimes it takes some sort of event or a series of events to kind of have you take a step back or get out of your own head to be like, wait, this doesn't feel right. Or, I'm tired of putting myself last all the time. Mm-hmm. What are some things that either you've found helpful or that you coach your clients on, how they can kind of recover from people pleasing? And, secondly, there is, I feel like, a difference between people pleasing, like you and Eric were talking about, mm-hmm. and just being a generous, kind person, because the difference to me is, that people pleaser can't say no.
Sure.
And make their boundaries known that, what, I'm still a kind person, but this doesn't suit me right now. So.
Yeah, I was thinking even about because I'm like, okay, people pleasing, and it's going to be different for every person. Like, so first of all, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh no, I'm a people pleaser, like I'm doing
right.
It's like, well, everybody has something.
Sure. Right.
So I was like, there's so many different routes you could go with like being a people pleaser, and what kind of synonyms you could almost ascribe to that, or mm-hmm. what it's kind of like akin to. So we kind of talked about codependency. And then the other one that comes to mind is this, you can call it a martyr or like a rescuer.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So something I often reference, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's called the Karpman Triangle.
I haven't heard of it.
Basically, there's the rescuer, there's the victim, and there's the perpetrator. And so they're just three different kind of set points that we start from in conflict that are unhelpful. And typically people will like move all around. So mm-hmm. It's not like, oh, I'm always a victim. Like I might flip in 1 minute to the perpetrator.
Right.
And then to the martyr, but oftentimes I'll even work with people just knowing like, what is your kind of set point? It's like, do you default always to like, or do you default most of the time to being a perpetrator? So somebody who starts attacking, mm-hmm. do you default to like victim? Do you default to what they kind of call a rescuer, which I think would be in the realm of people pleasing or martyrdom.
Yeah.
Which again, oftentimes in therapy, they say like the hardest person to treat on that triangle is the rescuer. Mm-hmm. And it's because there's so much defense. Like the defense is so much around like, no, I'm helping you. I'm doing good. But yeah, I think the key distinction between somebody who's like giving generously and somebody who's in this people pleasing state lies like within yourself, which mm-hmm. is like, are you resentful? Because if you're giving out of a place of true giving, I don't think that the resentment normally shows up.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of it, before you can even get into like healing, how do you heal or how do you get better, is like, you have to understand what's happening for you. Mm-hmm. Of like, do I want to be doing this? Am I over functioning? So this also goes back to like, where does this come from? Like, as an adult, am I doing something for another adult that they can actually do for themselves?
Right.
Which like in my family of origin, maybe you learned, oh, mom can't help herself or dad can't help himself. So I have to do these things. And then now you're in your marriage and you're doing things for your partner that they don't need you to do. Mm-hmm. And then you're making them pay. So the one I hear a lot, which actually shows in my own marriage too, is like, how does Eric leave so many articles of clothing in so many different places around our house? And so there was a time where I would pick all this up and I would just like be resentful. And sometimes we would laugh about it, but sometimes instead of having a clear conversation of like, hey, what can we do to solve this problem? Mm-hmm. I would just be like, there's this jacket again. There's this again. There's this, that. And then when he came home, I would expect him to be so happy that I picked up all his things. And then inside of him, because we can have like honest conversations in our marriage, inside of him, he's kind of like, why are you moving all my stuff all the time? Like now I never know where anything is. This is so annoying that I don't know where anything is. And I'm over here like, you should thank me.
That's right.
But really I'm moving all the clothes for me because I don't like that level of disorder.
Right.
And then I'm saying, and now you should be happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
We had a great solution to this. We just got a nice clothing, like a rack that you normally put a suitcase on, and then we just pile all of his clothes there in a part of the room I can't see.
Nice.
So it's, that's like finding solutions, can be helpful.
Compromise. There we go. Yeah.
But yeah, is there this thing showing up? I think that's like a key in the people pleasing is like, is there something showing up where you're doing something that's kind of for yourself, but you're expecting the other person to be grateful? And it doesn't mean the other person's doing something right. It's just like, can you communicate from an adult stance of like, hey, I really appreciate it if we could work together to find a solution for the clothes being all over the place. Let's work on this together. And then you have to actually allow the other person to uphold what they say they're going to do.
Yeah. Well, let me piggyback off that question, because this did happen in my marriage, that I also like order and I'm not saying I need my floors to be clean enough that you could eat off of them, because, I like to think that I'm reasonable thinking, I've got 3 kids and, a dog, we're going to make a mess, and it's not always going to stay clean, but man, do I like it when it's clean. So I was told, well, I don't even know why you're cleaning, because it's just going to get dirty again. And I feel like, seriously? I can't believe, and again, to your point, like that wasn't important to him, but it's important to me. And so we totally missed the mark on that, because neither one of us could see the other person's point of view, I guess.
Yeah. And there's so much in that I like have curiosity about. It's like when somebody's saying, I don't even know why you're doing this, it's just going to get dirty again. It's like, I could make up 10 different stories. Like, oh, does the other person want more of your attention? Like wants you to clean less and pay more attention to him? Does he feel trapped? And these are things maybe I've heard in my office, not my own home. Does he feel like kind of constrained by how clean things need to be? Does there could be so many different things. So it's like, what are you actually saying there? Which I think is part of, you and I have had conversations about like communication, and that's what keeps me in business, is like trying to help people figure out what they're actually saying. Which is like something I have to work on in my own life. It's like, what am I actually saying?
Yeah.
Or what I learned really kind of early on in my marriage is like, do you want to find solutions, or do you want to just kind of be heard? And I mean, there's also this other very real thing that I think it's like, this is a total aside, but the Gottmans, who are kind of the marriage gods of therapy, I think they have research that like something like, I'm scared to say 80%, but a lot of the problems in relationships are actually unsolvable. And so they're saying like, solve the solvable ones and like let the unsolvable ones be, but still have conversation around it.
Yeah.
It's like, you're 2 different people. Like, even though I like order maybe more than Eric, he is like so particular, and I have a lot of times no like rhythm or rhyme for any. I don't do the same thing twice.
Wow, that's interesting.
I know. And so that comes up all the time. Like, I'm not going to change, and I know it's kind of irks him, and he's not going to change, and it irks me, and we have to navigate lots of situations. I always talk about this like infamous conversation we had for like, I think it was like a 3-hour conversation about where we were going to park at our house, because I was feeling controlled by one spot. And so, I mean, we solved it. Like, he has his one spot and I can park in the other like 3, depending on how I feel that day. It's like getting into, I think relationships get tricky when it's like we always have to come to an agreement versus maybe like a solution.
Yeah.
I have no idea where I was going now, but yeah, you kind of bring me back online. I think we were actually talking about how do you heal and strategies for kind of moving on. So yeah, we were talking about resentment. Another good way to think about resentment is like I'm drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
That is interesting.
And in my own journey, I really had to, and maybe you can relate to this. It's like, I, at some point, was just totally addicted to my resentment. Like, getting just basically like drunk on it. I would have these like rages in my head with another person, who most often was Eric, because it's like, okay, it's hard to be married.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who it is.
Right.
You're joining 2 totally different people together. But I really had to come to this place of recognizing that this was like an addiction to my my rage, my resentment that ultimately was rooted in people pleasing, that ultimately was rooted in like just this constant betrayal of myself and not being able to ask for what I want.
100%.
Advocate for myself, because asking for what you want is really risky and really vulnerable. That gets into like, I can talk about feelings another time, but like anger is the most vulnerable emotion because anger alerts people to like what you care about.
Right.
And so asking for what you want is very vulnerable. And so you can just live behind, and this is spoken from the true, I can play all the victim, perpetrator, martyr, but the martyr just feels so good. You can just help, air quotes, help people and then feel so good about yourself where really you're over functioning and you're angry. And
yes. I went down the path where I didn't want to have to ask for help because then that could potentially open up, oh, well, maybe she doesn't have it all together. And I was actually afraid to let people see that maybe it was nice to have help sometimes and I didn't want to ask for it, or, I didn't have it all together and I wanted everyone to think I did. So then there's that side of it too, where, not only was I a resentful people pleaser, but I hated myself for it because I'm like, what? This should be bringing people happiness when you're helping people, not making them feel angry and just like, oh yeah, like you said, it'd be festering in my head.
And it's like, in some ways, I don't know about you, but like what you're talking about, I'm like, oh, she was independent. Like, and I don't know what the world believes anymore, but when I was growing up, independence was like praised to the highest
exactly
degree.
Right.
Like you wanted to be independent. And then I hit this point where it's like, sounds like for you, I was like, I have no clue how to do relationship because I'm so independent.
Yes, right.
And so then my life kind of turned into this process, which I'm still figuring out, of like, how do you be interdependent? Like, how do I lean on you and you lean back on me versus just like kind of being over here in this isolated bubble where it's like, okay, you're independent, like great, I guess you're not dependent. But I don't know, things that are opposite of each other oftentimes kind of are very similar. And so independence isn't really what we want. Like, as I think about raising my own children, I'm like, yeah, I don't want to teach. I don't want them to ask for, it's hard to navigate because I'm like, if one of my older kids is saying like, oh, Mama, help me put my shoes on, but I know she can put her shoes on. It's like, hey, no, you got that.
Yeah.
But then maybe my second one actually does need help putting her shoes on.
Right.
And so you're kind of navigating these like, okay, how do I help when you actually need it? But how do I also teach you to fly on your own?
Yes. It is such a tricky area to go down, I think, just because I, like you, was raised to be independent. And my mom was very, very independent and has told me and my younger sister numerous times that I'm going to raise you to be independent. I don't want you to have to rely on anyone. I want you to, know that you can do anything on your own.
Own money, own car.
Absolutely, exactly. You know the spiel and the song and dance. And so that totally came with me to my marriage, where I didn't want his help for anything. In fact, I almost thought that was my role, that, I stayed at home and took care of the kids and he went to work and provided financially and I took care of everything else. And again, increased that resentment where I'm like, but I have a degree and I went to school for something, not to be, a stay-at-home mom, but I agreed to that. And so like I had this internal struggle all the time with, what is my role? Who am I? What in the hell am I doing with my life?
Yeah, and can you even be honest? It's so complicated.
It's so complicated.
I can speak to that just being, and it's like we're all bringing these messages from our family of origin and then like bringing them into our lives today and then navigating them in the world at large. And so it's like, can you even say, did you, like, there's nothing wrong with being a working mom, a stay-at-home mom, a half and half mom, like whatever. But
right. Exactly.
Can you tell the truth to yourself about what you actually want? Because it's like, if you're staying home, but you actually maybe want to be working, well, again, that doesn't work.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the thing, Megan. I don't know that I did know what I wanted.
I know.
I had no idea. And I think definitely as a first-time parent, you don't have any idea of what you want or what you're doing until you go through it. And then as you go through it, things get more and more complicated. Sure. You might have another kid. you might move cities like we did. And so I felt like the complications just kept piling and piling on. And then it's hard to get out of that and, dig out of it and really figure out what it is you want, because, there's so many layers.
Yeah. And then there's what you want, and then like, what's the best option, or just what's the most available option? Because it's like, oh, maybe I want to work and be with my kids all the time. Okay. How is that going to work?
Yeah.
And so there's like identifying. It's been helpful in my own journey of recovering and like coming back to myself, to like, I'm often asking myself like, okay, regardless of what you actually do, can you be honest with yourself about what you want in this moment? So let's say it's like, okay, I want to stay home with my kids full time. Like, maybe that's just I'm just playing something out. It's not even necessarily true, but it's like, okay, that's my full desire. But I don't know, like, it seems like I'm a good version of myself, or maybe the best version of myself when I'm working. So it's like, okay, well, do I want to do that with this? But I don't know. There's, or maybe I have to do this. Or maybe it's like, oh, your husband's job is so demanding, like it kind of only affords for one person to be able to work.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, well, what are our options? Do we have enough money to hire a full-time nanny as well?
That's the thing. Childcare is so expensive.
Yeah.
So
well,
I hear you.
It's hard to have two working parents, because like, if the child gets sick, who stays home? Whose job can suffer? Where's the money? So I know plenty of families that have two working parents that also have important jobs. So then they hire basically a nanny, and even if the kids are in school, but it's like, we have to have this other person that we pay in case somebody's sick, or in case somebody forgets their lunch, or whatever it is, rather than one of them stay home to be available. So I don't know. There's a lot. I mean, not just in a parenting, but I think in anything, it's like, okay, there's admitting to yourself about what you actually want, and then there's what you're actually going to do.
Yeah.
Because what you want isn't always what's best for the situation.
Right.
But when you come from a family where you are really trained to perform or to dance monkey, you lose connection with what you want. And it just becomes like, do.
Right. Yeah.
And then if you do that enough, it's like, you walked into my kids' coloring, and like, I watch my kids and how different they are, and I just watch what they're attracted to. And then we kind of nurture that. I'm like, wow, this is so easy. Like, one of them is just a coloring fiend and into princess stuff. And so it's like, okay, what do you want for your birthday? I want a princess crown. Okay. Like, and we just go with that.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, I, for various reasons, was trained to just do, and to be a certain way, and to have certain interests that I'm like envious of my children, because I'm like, what was I like as a child, or what would I have been into if that was kind of available to me?
Right. Funny that you mentioned that, because I feel like how I was raised is not necessarily how I have chosen to raise my kids. I definitely feel, and not that I'm saying that like my childhood was all terrible, because it wasn't, but I feel like some of the things that I swore I would never do with my kids are the things that have affected me, I guess, like in my own marriage and, as an adult. And so one of those is being like the nurturing of your kids and noticing like, yeah, they can certainly put their own shoes on by themselves, but if they ask for my help, you're darn right I'm going to help them put on their shoes, because they're asking for my help, and I want them to know that I'm there to help them. And so I feel like, I've struggled with that as a parent, being told like, oh, you coddle your kids too much, or, whatever. But I definitely feel like I have some PTSD from when I was a kid, being told and taught to, you're perfectly capable. If you're not bleeding, you're fine. If you don't have a broken arm sticking out, then suck it up. And I don't know. I just feel like that has shaped the parent that I've become, because I want my kids to know that I'm there,
Yeah, it's tricky to navigate, because even in my own family, it's like, okay, yeah, I want to nurture what you want to do, but then there's also just like things you need to do as part of our family, and there's also this balance of like, well, you can't just color all day,
right? Exactly. As much as we would love
do this or do that, and so yeah, it's really tricky. It's like we can't also, I think people get into something we call opposition reaction, but it's like, I'm just going to do the opposite of where it came from, but then you actually end up doing kind of the same thing. So, like, a lot of times people, if anybody that knows me knows, like, I played golf. There were some great things that came out of that, yes. But, like, I didn't enjoy playing golf, and it was something I did because I felt like I had to.
Right.
And that doesn't mean, like, I have some of my best friends in the world that came from me playing golf at Kentucky. Like, my coach there is still, like, a dear friend to me and really, like, mothered me. You know, like, there's good things from this, but at the root of it, it's not what I would have chosen to do. And so sometimes people will ask me, like, oh, are you going to teach your kids how to play golf? Well, they'll make comments like, I bet you're not going to teach your kids how to play golf. And it's like, I'm going to expose my kids to golf. Like, most of my girlfriends now are trying to learn how to play golf. Like, it's a skill that a lot of people end up wishing they had down the line. And so it's like, I'm not going to just be like, well, I didn't like this. You're never swinging a club.
Right.
Because then what good is that doing? Like, now I'm just preventing my kids from something that I actually have to offer. But I'm sure as hell not going to, like, slug them out to the golf course every day if they don't want to go and they're crying about it. Like, some of it's developmental. Like, yeah, they might not want to go sometimes, but I'm definitely going to expose them to it. And then it's kind of like, okay, if you're interested, we'll keep doing it. But if you're not interested, we're moving on.
Yes. Right.
But if I were just like, oh, I didn't like this, so you're done. Like, I've just now done the opposite. Like, it's like, okay, golf was, like, pushed on me, and so now I'm gonna, like, hide it from you. And are we any better off at the end of the day?
Yeah, right.
Because now I just gave you what I wanted as a child, rather than, like, looking at what you want or what you might need. And so I think that's the thing when it's, like, comes down to coddling your kids or helping your kids. It's like, a lot of people in my office are working on this as parents. It's really like, you have to know your own story so that you can see your own child accurately. Otherwise, you're just giving your child what you wish you would have had in your childhood.
Right.
Which is no good to them necessarily.
Right.
Because you're missing them in the same way you were missed.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and it's hard. It's really, it's super hard work because you have to have a lot of self-awareness. But, you know, I mean, I hear this all the time, people I'm around. It's like, oh, you know, you should be grateful because my parents never gave me ABC. And it's like, well, I don't know. Does your child want that? Or is that just what you wish your parents would have given you?
Right.
Or do they need that? Because I mean, again, a lot of this is the difference of, like, want and need. And then it's also, like, what's best.
Yeah, right.
Or just, like, what's even possible. Like, I like, tell people, so in part of the work I do when people join a group, if you want to work on people pleasing, come join a group, because you'll start people pleasing and people in the group will tell you to stop doing it. And then, they won't tell you to stop. They'll tell you how they feel, or they'll say, like, Natalie, is this actually what you think? Or are you just, like, telling me what I want to hear?
Yeah. They'll call you out. Yeah.
Which then you can be like, oh, I don't know. Like, you know, so it's kind. Like, sometimes I think people are afraid of group because they're like, somebody's going to come, like, punch me verbally,
well,
you know?
Yeah.
But it's like, no, they're going to mirror things back to you that hopefully you want to work on. But I'm like, man, having a third child is, like, the best thing I ever did for being a group leader. Because it's like, when we're eating, you know, it's like I might have 2 kids eating and, like, I might be feeding the other child or changing a diaper or whatever. And the other day, my oldest was like, Mama, can I have a fork? And I was like, yeah, like, let me get it. And it's not like I'm just, like, chilling, not getting her a fork, you know? Like, I've got 10 other things going on. So I'm like, yeah, like, let me change this diaper, then I'll get you a fork. And then I forgot about the fork. So she's like, Mama, could I have a fork? And I'm like, yeah, let me get it. I'm filling up a water, though, you know?
Yes, the next thing on the list.
So then I forget again. And then she's like, Mama, could I go get myself a fork?
Aww.
And part of me felt this, like, intense shame. It's like, I just failed her. And the other part of me is like, that's great. Like, yeah, go get your own fork. Like, I think she even, like, realized, like, oh, I can do that myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, the other part of me is like, oh, I feel bad that I forgot, like, 3 times. But also I'm like, well, I mean, this is where it comes back to group. I'm, like, teaching her to advocate for herself, like, over and over. Like, by the time we get to be adults and what else you show up in a group, it's like, well, I've already asked you twice. I don't want to ask a 3rd time. And it's like, I'm not intentionally neglecting my child. It's just like there's a lot of needs in our family right now. And so, hopefully if it was something more important than a fork, I would stop what I was doing and help her, be present with her.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it also helped her see like, oh, I can do this myself.
Mm-hmm.
So
good for her.
I know. I was like proud and sad at the same time.
Exactly. Aw, so sweet. So sweet. Well, I have really enjoyed having you as our guest for this episode. Thank you so much. Before I let you go, I wanted to see if you had any parting words of wisdom that you would like to give our listeners.
I think probably two things is like, I feel like strongly that I don't want people to be attacking themselves for anything maybe they've heard, or if you're recognizing you're a people pleaser. It's like, again, like I kind of said earlier, everybody has their own ways that they learn to cope in their family of origin that then show up in your current relationship. And it's really about, like, I think you were talking about one of your friends before this. It's like, how do you move into being an accountable, I don't even like the word survivor, but like an accountable adult maybe, because a lot of us are out here like living in adult bodies, but we're like emotionally very young inside.
Right.
And so part of moving into being like an accountable adult is taking responsibility for your life today. And part of that is like knowing your story, knowing where you came from. So even like we're talking about in parenting, so you can show up to like, well, I guess it's relationships. So you can show up with like to the person in front of you and not be replicating something out of your younger self. But again, it's like therapy or like any self-discovery work. I always want the person to be asking themselves, like, is this moving me forward relationally? Because we can definitely get stuck, and we kind of live in a culture that's in some ways promoting this in a cycle that's just like pathologizing. So just like, let's just put words on how we are, and let's really kind of, like demonize our parents about everything they did wrong. And now here I am, and I know all these things that went wrong, and I know all these things that are wrong with me, but it's like, so what?
Yeah.
Like
we've all had something.
What? Like,
right.
If you came in my office and you're like, I'm a people pleaser and I'm just so resentful, like I would be like, okay, and like, now what? Like, are we gonna stay there?
Yeah, right.
Or like, are we gonna like develop skills to like move through this? And so that would be the biggest thing I'd be saying is like, we're all human, we all have things, and just make sure the self-discovery work you're doing, again, that you're moving through and forward versus like staying stuck in a place where you're attacking yourself or people around you. And that's not to say there's not like accountability that needs to happen and all that stuff, but I want people to move forward to get more of themselves and ideally a better life.
Love that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Where can people find you if they want to connect and follow your advice, which I did.
Sometimes I'm on Instagram and sometimes I'm not. Okay. It's really like, is this
when you have time?
Yeah, well, it's time, but also like social media can just be not helpful.
Yes, so I know.
I find myself like, I'll be there and then I'll leave and then I'll come and then I'll go. So sometimes I'm there, but you can always find me on my website. Hopefully, you'll link that.
I will link that, okay, yes, for sure.
Sometimes I'm on Instagram. Hopefully, we have more conversations. You can find me here.
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you so much, Megan. It's been a pleasure having you.
Awesome. Thank you.